It was 11:58 p.m. when my phone vibrated against the worn wooden surface of my cutting table. In the silence of my shop, the sudden buzz sounded less like a notification and more like an alarm. I wasn't expecting anyone. At 64, living alone above a dusty alteration shop on the edge of town, messages at this hour usually meant bad news or a wrong number. I set down my fabric shears, wiping a stray thread from my glasses, and picked up the device. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in 3 years. Tiffany. My daughter. My estranged daughter, who had once told me that my presence was corrosive to her husband's political brand. I stared at the text bubble, waiting for the familiar ache of rejection to settle in my chest, but it didn't come. Instead, I just felt cold. The message wasn't a greeting. Thanksgiving, 6 p.m. The staging house on Elm. Dress appropriately. We need to discuss your liquid assets. Do not be late. I read it twice. Then a third time. No, hi Mom. No, I hope you're well. Just a summons. It had been 3 years since I'd last held my grandchildren, Connor and Chloe. 3 years since Tiffany had stood in this very shop, wrinkling her nose at the smell of starch and old wool, telling me that a seamstress mother was bad optics for Bradley's city council campaign. She had called my life small and embarrassing. She had evicted me from their lives with the same casual efficiency she used to fire interns. And now, this. Liquid assets. The phrase hung in the air, clinical and predatory. It wasn't an invitation to a family dinner. It was a subpoena. She didn't want her mother. She wanted a resource. She assumed I was still just the quiet woman in the back room, stitching hems and saving pennies in a jar, perhaps sitting on a meager retirement fund she could harvest. She had no idea. I didn't type a reply. I didn't let my hands shake. I simply placed the phone face down on the table, next to a spool of gold thread. The vibration stopped, but the silence in the room had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with the weight of things unsaid and debts unpaid. They thought they were summoning a servant. They didn't know they were inviting the executioner. Before we find out why she's suddenly texting after 3 years of silence, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. My pulse remained steady. The panic that usually accompanied Tiffany's name had been replaced by the cold, heavy weight of the secret sitting in my bank account. I set the phone aside and picked up my tablet. I tapped the icon for my bank, waited for the facial recognition to scan my tired eyes, and watched the screen load. The number was there, stark and absolute against the white background. $750 million. It was the post-tax lump sum from the Powerball jackpot I had won quietly 2 weeks ago. I hadn't told a soul. I hadn't quit my job. I hadn't bought a mansion or a yacht or even a new sewing machine. I had simply hired a lawyer, set up a blind trust, and gone back to work. For 14 days, I had sat in this shop, shortening sleeves and taking in waistlines, knowing that with a single wire transfer, I could buy the entire city block. I could buy Tiffany's staging house, her husband's campaign, and the very ground they walked on. I stared at the balance. It looked ridiculous, like a glitch in the Matrix. But it was real, and it was mine. Tiffany thought she was summoning a destitute old woman who might have a few $1,000s tucked away in a mattress. She thought she was squeezing a lemon for its last few drops of juice. She didn't realize she was trying to mug a central bank. I locked the screen. The glow faded, plunging the room back into the dim afternoon light. I didn't reply to her text. I didn't ask what liquid assets she was referring to. I picked up my needle. The trousers on my table belonged to a retired bus driver named Mr. Henderson. He needed them hemmed by Tuesday. I slid the steel through the fabric, finding the rhythm that had sustained me for 40 years. In, out, in, out. I would go to dinner. Not because I was desperate for their affection. Not because I missed the grandchildren I hadn't been allowed to see since they were children. I would go because a debt had been called in, and it was time to settle the account. But not with money. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet room, and walked to the back of the shop. There was a small, fireproof safe hidden behind a stack of wool bolts. I spun the dial left, right, left. The heavy door creaked open. Inside, next to the lottery paperwork, sat a book. It wasn't a checkbook. It was an old, fabric-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. I pulled it out and blew the dust off the cover. I hadn't opened it in 3 years, not since the day Tiffany told me I wasn't welcome at Connor's graduation. I flipped through the pages. It wasn't a record of profits and losses. It was a record of transactions. Every time I swallowed an insult. Every time I sewed a dress for Tiffany that she claimed was designer. Every time I paid a bill they forgot. Every time they treated me like a ghost in my own life. I ran my finger down the last entry. The ink was dry, but the debt was still outstanding. I tucked the ledger into my purse. They wanted to discuss assets? Fine, we would discuss assets. But first, we were going to conduct an audit. The shop was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the back room and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. I sat there, the ledger heavy in my lap, and let the memories wash over me. They weren't warm, fuzzy memories of baking cookies or bedtime stories. They were sharp, like the bite of a needle. I looked at my hands. The skin was rough, calloused from 40 years of handling heavy wool and stiff denim. These hands had paid for Tiffany's private school. They had paid for her political science degree. They had paid for the down payment on her first condo when Bradley was just a junior staffer, with a bright smile and empty pockets. I had sewn until my fingers bled, literally, taping them up with masking tape so I wouldn't stain the silk of her graduation dress. And how had she repaid me? With a guillotine. It happened 3 years ago at Bradley's campaign launch for city council. I had closed the shop early, put on my best dress and navy blue sheath I'd made myself and driven to the event hall. I was so proud. My daughter, the wife of a councilman, I found her near the catering table. She looked radiant, polished to a shine. But when she saw me, her smile didn't reach her eyes. It shattered. She pulled me into the service corridor, her grip tight enough to bruise. "Mom, you can't be out there," she hissed. "You smell like steam and old fabric. It's sticking to your hair." I stood there, stunned. I showered Tiff. I put on my good perfume. "It's not the perfume. It's the shop," she said, her voice low and frantic. "Bradley is selling a narrative of generational wealth and stability. You look tired. You look like labor. Just stay in the kitchen with the staff, okay? Please, don't ruin this." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel and walked back into the light, leaving me in the gray hallway that smelled of garbage and industrial cleaner. That was the moment I understood. Tiffany wasn't just mean, she was a climber. And climbers know that gravity is the enemy. To rise, you have to shed weight. You have to cut the ropes that tether you to the ground. I wasn't her mother anymore. I was the sandbag she had to cut loose to let her hot air balloon rise. She had amputated me from her life, not because she hated me, but because she was terrified that my calloused hands would drag her back down to the working class. I sat in the dark shop, running my thumb over the ledger's cover. She thought she had cut me loose. She thought she had escaped the smell of the shop. But she forgot one thing. The climber needs the ground more than the ground needs the climber. And gravity always wins in the end. I stood up and put the ledger in my purse. I wasn't going to the staging house to beg for a relationship. I was going to remind her that you can't outrun your roots, especially when those roots are the only thing holding you up. 2 days before Thanksgiving, the bell above my shop door chimed. It wasn't the gentle tinkle that announced a regular customer bringing in a torn hem. It was an aggressive, demanding jangle. I didn't look up from the sewing machine immediately. I finished the line of stitching on Mrs. Gable's winter coat, cut the thread, and then turned my stool. Bradley stood in the center of the shop. My son-in-law, the councilman. He looked like he had been cut out of a magazine and pasted into the wrong background. His Italian suit cost more than my rent for the year. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his upper lip, betraying the cool, confident image on his campaign posters. "Cynthia," he said, his voice slick with false warmth. "We missed you at the fundraiser last week." "I wasn't invited," I said, my voice flat. "And I was working." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He walked toward the counter, running a finger along a bolt of blue silk. He grimaced at the dust on his fingertip. "Always working." "That's admirable. But Tiffany is worried. She thinks you're hoarding your resources, living like a pauper when you could be investing in the family legacy." "Is that what we're calling it now?" I asked. "Investments?" He leaned over the counter, invading my space. The smell of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke wafted over me. "Look, Cynthia, I know you have a nest egg. Maybe you sold the deed to this place. Maybe you have a retirement fund you haven't touched. We need a bridge loan. Just until the next quarter. It's for the campaign. It's for the kids." "I don't have a nest egg, Bradley. I have a shop." His eyes hardened. The mask slipped. "Don't play coy. We know you're sitting on something. And you need to think about your future. You want to see Connor and Chloe, don't you? It would be a shame if schedules got tight. Grandparents' rights are so tricky in this state. If you aren't contributing to the household, it's hard to justify the time." I sat very still. He was holding my grandchildren hostage for a check. He didn't know I could buy his freedom or his destruction with the change in my pocket. He thought he was squeezing a stone. He didn't know the stone was uranium. He straightened up, buttoning his jacket. He looked around the shop, his gaze lingering on the exposed pipes in the ceiling. "And this place? It's a fire trap, Cynthia. Old wiring, fabric everywhere. I'd hate for the fire marshal to pay a visit. They can be very thorough. It would be terrible if you were shut down right before the holidays." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a glossy campaign flyer. He slapped it onto the counter like an eviction notice. His face beamed up from the paper, airbrushed and trustworthy. "Thursday. 6 o'clock, he said. "Bring your checkbook. Think of it as insurance." He turned and walked out. The bell jangled again, leaving silence in his wake. I looked at his face on the flyer. Bradley for counsel. A secure future. He had threatened my livelihood. He had threatened my access to my blood. He thought he was the wolf in the room. He didn't realize he had just walked into the butcher shop. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the fire marshal to preemptively schedule an inspection. I flipped the sign on the door to closed, locked the deadbolt, and picked up my phone. I scrolled past the family contacts blocked or ignored to a number I hadn't used in 6 months. "Robert?" I said when he answered. "It's Cynthia, the seamstress. I need to cash in that favor." 20 minutes later, Robert walked through the back door. He wasn't just a loyal customer whose bespoke suits I had been tailoring for 15 years. He was a retired forensic accountant for the FBI who had spent his career dismantling Ponzi schemes and tracking cartel money. He sat on a stool, his sharp eyes scanning the campaign flyer I had left on the counter. "He threatened you?" Robert asked, his voice low and dangerous. "He threatened the shop. He threatened my access to the kids." I pushed a fresh cup of tea toward him, but he made a mistake. "He assumes I'm broke. He assumes I'm stupid. I need you to follow the threads, Robert. He needs money fast. 500,000 by Monday, according to the whispers I heard at the market. Find out why." Robert cracked his knuckles and opened his laptop. For the next 3 hours, the only sounds in the shop were the clicking of keys and the hum of my sewing machine as I nervously hemmed the same pair of pants 3 times. I watched him work, navigating public records, campaign finance disclosures, and shell company registries with the ease of a conductor leading an orchestra. Finally, he stopped. He turned the laptop around. "Here," he said, pointing to a web of transactions. "He's not just broke, Cynthia. He's embezzling. He moved campaign funds into a personal account to cover gambling debts in Vegas last month. Then he moved money from the city's development fund to cover the campaign hole. He's playing a shell game, but he's running out of shells. The audit is Monday. If he doesn't replace the 500 grand, he's going to federal prison." I stared at the screen. The numbers were staggering. My son-in-law wasn't just a bad politician, he was a criminal. And Tiffany, she had to know. She managed his image. She knew where the bodies were buried, because she was the one digging the holes. He thinks I'm his bailout, I whispered. You have the lottery money, Robert said. You could pay it, make it go away. No. The word came out harder than I intended. If I pay it, they learn nothing. They'll just find another hole to dig. I don't want to save them, Robert. I want to stop them. I reached into my purse and pulled out my checkbook. I wrote a check for a staggering amount, $5 million. But I didn't write Bradley's name. I wrote the name of a specific nonprofit legal fund. Set up a blind trust, I told Robert. Donate this immediately to the opposition party's whistleblower fund. Earmark it specifically for the investigation into local council corruption. I want the best forensic team money can buy looking at his books by tomorrow morning. Robert looked at the check, then at me. A slow smile spread across his face. You're funding the investigation against your own son-in-law. I'm investing in justice, I said, smoothing the fabric on my table. And I'm making sure that when the hammer drops, it drops hard. I had just signed my family's death warrant with a ballpoint pen, and for the first time in years, my hands didn't shake. Thanksgiving Day arrived gray and bitter, the sky the color of a bruise. I dressed carefully in a tailored black dress I had made myself simple, elegant, and severe. I tucked the ledger into my purse, right next to the receipt for the wire transfer Robert had executed that morning. The staging house was a monstrosity of modern architecture, all glass and sharp angles, rented specifically to project an image of success, while Bradley's real assets were frozen. It smelled of nothing, no roasting turkey, no cinnamon, just the chemical scent of new paint and desperation. Tiffany opened the door. She was wearing a dress I had sewn for her 5 years ago, a pale pink chiffon number she had once called quaint. Now, she was trying to pass it off as vintage designer. Her smile was tight, her eyes scanning my outfit for weaknesses. You're late, she lied. It was exactly 6 o'clock. Traffic, I said, stepping past her into the cavernous foyer. The house was cold. They hadn't turned on the heat, likely to save money on the utility bill they couldn't afford. In the living room, my grandchildren, Connor and Chloe, sat on a white leather sofa, scrolling on their phones. They looked miserable. When they saw me, they didn't run to hug me. They glanced up, gave a polite nod, and looked back down. They had been coached. Be nice to Grandma. We need her. Hi, kids, I said softly. Hey, Grandma, Connor mumbled. Chloe just waved. It broke my heart, but I didn't let it show. I wasn't here to be the doting grandmother today. I was here to be the lesson. We moved to the dining room. The table was set with rented china and heavy silver that looked too big for the meager spread. The food was catered, but clearly from a budget menu: dry turkey, lumpy potatoes, and a salad that was mostly iceberg lettuce. It was a performance of wealth put on by people who were drowning. Bradley sat at the head of the table, pouring wine with a hand that shook slightly. He filled my glass too full. To family, he toasted, his voice booming in the empty room. And to legacy. We drank. The wine was cheap and vinegary. For 20 minutes, we ate in excruciating silence. The only sound was the scrape of forks against porcelain. Tiffany kept shooting nervous glances at Bradley. Bradley kept checking his watch. The air was thick with unspoken demands. Finally, Bradley set down his fork. He cleared his throat. Cynthia, he began, leaning forward. We're so glad you could make it. It's important for the family to be together, especially. Well, especially now. We have an exciting opportunity we wanted to share with you. Here it comes. We're launching a new initiative. Tiffany chimed in, her voice shrill. A community reinvestment fund. It's going to secure the family's future for generations. But we need a founding partner, someone with vision. We need $5 million. Bradley interrupted, dropping the pretense. By Monday morning, it's a bridge loan. We'll pay you back double in 6 months. I looked at them. I looked at my grandchildren, who were watching with wide, frightened eyes. They knew something was wrong. A bridge loan, I repeated. For the campaign? For the family, Bradley said, his voice hardening. For Connor's tuition, for Chloe's future. If we don't get this funding, things could get difficult. We might have to make cuts. We might have to move away. The threat was subtle but clear. Pay up, or you never see them again. I reached into my purse. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out the ledger. I placed it on the table with a soft thud. I'm glad you brought up investments, I said, opening the book to the first page. Because before we discuss new business, we need to settle the old accounts. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. Tiffany stared at the fabric-bound book as if it were a bomb. Bradley just looked confused, his brow furrowed as he tried to calculate what kind of account could possibly be contained in a book that smelled like lavender and dust. What is that? Tiffany asked, her voice tight. We don't need your diary, Mom. We need a wire transfer. It's not a diary, I said, flipping the cover open. It's a ledger. I started it 20 years ago. The day you told me you were embarrassed to have me pick you up from school because my car was old. I started keeping track. I ran my finger down the first page. March 12th, 1,998. Ballet lessons, $400. Paid by sewing 14 prom dresses in 1 week. You never said thank you. You complained the shoes weren't the brand everyone else had, Tiffany scoffed. Seriously? You're bringing up ballet lessons? That was decades ago. Debts accumulate interest, I said calmly. I turned the page. June 2005. Political science tuition, $32,000. Paid by cashing out my 401k. You told your friends you had a scholarship because you didn't want them to know your mother was a seamstress. Bradley shifted in his seat. Cynthia, this is ancient history. We're talking about the future, about legacy. We are talking about legacy, I corrected him. October 2018. The down payment on your first house, $50,000. The money I had saved to fix the roof of my shop. I gave it to you. And in return, you banned me from the housewarming party because I didn't fit the aesthetic. I looked up. Tiffany was trembling, but not with shame. With rage. Stop it, she screamed. Stop keeping score. Family doesn't keep score. We support each other. We need $5 million, Mom. We are going to lose everything. Don't you care? I care, I said. I care enough to finally balance the books. I closed the ledger. The soft thud echoed like a gavel strike. You want to know about my assets? Fine. I won the Powerball 2 weeks ago. $750 million. The air left the room. It was instant and absolute. Bradley's mouth fell open. Tiffany went pale, her eyes widening as the number sank in. Connor and Chloe looked up from their phones, realizing for the first time that the grandmother they ignored was the most powerful person in the room. 700, Bradley whispered. A greedy, desperate light ignited in his eyes. He stood up, knocking his chair back. Cynthia! Oh my God! That's incredible! Why didn't you say so? This solves everything. We can pay off the campaign debt. We can buy the house. We can... Sit down, I said. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The authority in my voice was absolute. Bradley sat. You can't solve anything, I said, because the money isn't available to you. What do you mean? Tiffany asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and terror. It's your money. We're your family. You are my relatives, I corrected. But you are not my creditors. And as of this morning, the account is closed. I reached into my purse one last time and pulled out the receipt Robert had given me. I slid it across the table toward Bradley. I made a donation this morning, I said. $5 million. Bradley grabbed the paper. His hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled against the china. He read it. His face turned gray. The whistleblower fund? He choked out. The opposition party's whistleblower fund? specifically earmarked for the investigation into city council corruption, I clarified. I didn't just refuse to bail you out, Bradley. I funded the team that is going to audit you. I bought the shovel for your grave. Tiffany screamed. It was a primal, horrifying sound. You ruined us. You ruined your own family. How could you? I didn't ruin you, I said, standing up. I just stopped paying for the illusion. You can't pay emotional debts with financial currency, Tiffany, and you are overdrawn. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. It might have been my imagination, or it might have been the inevitable arrival of consequences. I didn't stay to find out. I picked up my ledger, turned my back on the feast of lies, and walked out the door. The fallout was swift, brutal, and televised. The investigation I funded didn't just open a door. It blew the house down. Bradley was arrested 48 hours after Thanksgiving, led out of the staging house in handcuffs while news helicopters circled overhead. Tiffany's social standing evaporated instantly. The friends she had climbed over to get to the top kicked her down the ladder with glee. She was left with nothing but a closet full of clothes she couldn't afford to dry clean and a reputation she couldn't scrub clean. But I wasn't finished. There were 2 loose ends left to tie, Connor and Chloe. I met them a week later at a small diner near their school. They looked terrified. For the first time in their lives, the safety net of generational wealth had been cut, and they were free-falling. They expected me to lecture them, or worse, to ignore them the way they had ignored me. Are we poor now? Chloe asked, her voice small. Your parents are, I said gently, but you don't have to be. I pulled 2 thick envelopes from my purse. Inside were the deeds to trusts I had established for each of them. The amounts were substantial enough to ensure they never had to worry, ever again. But there was a catch. This is the legacy of the Stitch, I told them. These trusts are locked. Connor looked at the paperwork. What condition? The gap year clause, I said. Before you get the money, you must spend 2 years working a service job. You must live on a median income, pay your own rent, and mend your own clothes. No bailouts. No safety nets. They stared at me. Stunned. I'm not doing this to be cruel, I explained, reaching across the table to take their hands. I'm doing it because your parents tried to give you the world without teaching you how to carry it. Wealth without work is a poison. I don't want to leave you just cash. I want to leave you resilience. I want you to know that if the world tears, you have the skill to stitch it back together yourselves. I left them there with the envelopes and a choice. It was up to them now. I walked back to my shop. The sign on the door said, "Open." I didn't need to work. I could have closed the shutters and flown to Paris, but I walked inside, tied on my apron, and sat down at my machine. I picked up a piece of velvet and threaded the needle. The hum of the motor was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a life built with my own hands, stitch by honest stitch. I am not just a seamstress. I am the architect of my own piece. And for the first time in a long time, the ledger is balanced. Cynthia taught us that self-respect is the most expensive thing you own, and you should never put it on sale. If you believe in building your own worth, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, what is the one boundary you need to set with your family today?